When we think of advanced minds that are capable of having these rich perceptual experiences, we often think of the human mind. And if not the human mind, then maybe the mind of an ape or of a dolphin or of a dog or a pig. All cousins to humans, evolutionarily speaking. Advanced minds capable of memory and theory of mind and problem solving and play. These types of mind actually they develop more than once on Earth at least. And so for this week's book club, we'll be looking at a book called Other Minds, which looks at the deep sea origins of consciousness and Peter Godfrey, a philosopher's account of how subjective experience possibly crept into existence, how nature itself became self-aware, became sentient, and a lot of the philosophy, I guess, like surrounding this type of stuff. So I hope you guys enjoy the discussion and the presentation. I previously read this book maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, um, and I really liked it, and I kind of wanted to like revisit it because I like revisiting books. I feel like they can stick better, and you learn more if you reread things. But I wanted to go over this book, which is by Peter Godfrey, a philosopher. I think he's at the University of New York now, but he's like a really famous, well-known philosopher, and he decided to dedicate a book entirely to these questions of the origins of consciousness. He's also a part-time diver, I think. He like dives for fun. And so this book almost like it carries like two streams or strands. Like one is like his life and experience as a diver and his interactions he's had with these octopi. And the other is like the philosophical angle and the questions that he's trying to answer when it comes to understanding the minds of these other creatures. And so, yeah, I guess essentially I'm just going to walk through this book chapter by chapter and then read little bits here and there and just kind of explain all the main points. So if you guys haven't read it, no, you don't need to worry there at all. But essentially, Other Minds, like I just mentioned, it's kind of like two books and stories that are happening simultaneously, more or less. And as I mentioned, Peter Godfrey, he's a philosopher of science. Some people think he's a philosopher of biology because he focuses a lot on animals, but I think more generally he's probably just like a philosopher of mind, of science. And he's also a diver. And you kind of see that throughout this book. It's a very easy and accessible book to read. It's not academic, it's not overly jargony or anything like that. But the first half, essentially, is sketching out a natural history of these creatures, and I guess of us, indirectly. It talks about their colors, about their strange short lives, about their peculiar behaviors, and that's kind of the whole descriptive side of the book. It's just kind of like trying to recount the evolutionary story of these creatures. And then the other half of the book, which is more philosophical, is the questions that kind of come up about consciousness, how it came to be at all. Is it something that just kind of like emerged at one fork in the road in our evolutionary history by chance? Or is it something that emerges more frequently? Is it something that will kind of like pop up regardless of where life spawns if you give it enough time? And he takes after William James, which was a geologist, I think of the 1800s or something like that. But Darwin, for instance, he took a lot from William James as well. But essentially, William James, he endorses this view of looking at life and looking at phenomena, things like memory or perception or consciousness, not as these rigid and strict steps and like clean cuts that happen in nature, but more as a continuous and very like softly changing type of phenomenon. It's not like all of a sudden one Adam and Eve kind of popped up into existence and there you have consciousness and energy. No, it was this like slow process of maybe things that looked like proto-consciousness or simple consciousness or simple perceptions, and then they kind of like built onto each other and evolved and developed into what you and me now consider consciousness. And the reason why this book is dedicated to, or why octopi or cephalopods, I guess more generally, they kind of like come into this discussion, is that they're the only other creature with large nervous systems that isn't a type of variation on the mammalian nervous system. And they're the only other creature that seem to possess capacities of mind. And so the reason that they're chosen in this book is that if we want to understand minds, Peter Godfrey believes that the minds of cephalopods are the most distinct and removed types of minds to human minds. And that's why he wants to investigate consciousness from their point of view, from their evolutionary fork. And so he starts off, I guess, with two little anecdotes. One is an anecdote of when his colleague or his partner, he drops off this anchor while he's out in the ocean, and goes to, I guess, see what's happening down at the seafloor there. And he comes across a kind of bed of different scallop shells. And he finds dozens of octopi living on it together, wrestling each other and high-fiving and touching each other. And this is a super impressive, I guess, thing to see, because octopi are known to be completely solitary creatures. So to see them in groups in these little communities, it completely blew him away. He did this another experience kind of drove this curiosity, I guess. And it was when he was doing some diving and around some I think it was around some sponges, like a sponge, I don't know, forest you might call it. And he notices a cuttlefish just looking at him and intently paying attention to him. And so that's kind of where he starts off. He's there seems to be this sense of mutual engagement that humans and these cephalopods can have, something that you can't have with all organisms. You don't have that type of engagement and acknowledgement of the other's existence with a tree or with sea sponges. You can have it with a lot of mammalian animals, a lot of animals that are close to us, like dogs and cats and monkeys and whatever. But not a type of mind that is so removed, not a type of organism that's been so far removed, that's evolutionarily so distinct. Can we have this engagement? So that's why they're targeting these cephalopods. And so kind of to sketch the evolutionary tree of these cephalopods, to understand how far away they are from us. It's that essentially sure, let's consider life to have started off right here. Some of the first forms of life were probably something close to, or some of the first forms of multicellular life, let's say, were probably these types of sponges or proto-jellyfish or cnaridians or anything like that. And it was at this point when maybe these clusters of cells they were gaining this ability to respond to their environment. So whether that be through understanding and perceiving that light's hitting them so they can float higher up to the surface to engage in photosynthesis, or whether it was just the ability to kind of move forward or eat certain things. And it was this chemical interaction where evolutionary biologists, they think that it's around here probably that the neuron may have developed. And it's when you start seeing the first bilaterians, or creatures with a type of nerve that goes down their spines like us. From there, around 600 million years ago, there was a branching though. There was a branching between humans, all other vertebrates, all other animals that are like us, and fish included in on that. And then creatures like mollusks, like these the little clams and stuff, and arthropods, so insects and lobsters and those types of creatures. And it was at that branching where I guess they're kind of focusing in on, because that's when both of our groups separated completely. And for one reason or another, they both developed divergingly. They both developed this ability of mind, this ability of sentience or consciousness. And so that's a big question and a big just a big question mark. And so essentially, a quote I took from the book is that evolution built minds twice over. And it's probably the closest thing, these cephalopods, they're the closest thing we'll meet to an intelligent alien because of how distant they are. He doesn't like this romantic reading of it. He doesn't like to kind of overfluff it or make it extra poetic. Thinking that, I don't know, some like, for example, some Hawaiian creationist stories, or like some non-scientific creationist stories, they like to think of octopi as some sort of like remnant and relic from like a distant past. Like, no, really, they started, kind of like evolving by our side. It was not that, I like this quote, it was not the Ishmael who escaped alone to tell the tale, but a distant relative who came down another line and has a different tale to tell. So the octopi, they were always with us, and the development of their minds were running in parallel to the development of our minds, just in a very different place and in their very different ways. And so the first thing he kind of like looks at, like I just kind of mentioned, was this movement from single cellular organisms to multicellular organisms, and then the move from multicellular organisms to multicellular organisms that can sense and act in accordance with their environment. And so we know that life is around 3.8 billion years old. Most of that has been single cells. It's only until relatively recently, maybe the past billion years, where we had multiple cells. And all of these cells, or multi-cells, they weren't idle. The cell kind of dies if it's idle. Take E. coli, for instance. E. coli, they have these types of sensors on the outside of their membrane. And they have what's called flagella on the inside. And this little like arc, or let's call it like a proto-neuron, that connects the outside world to their inside world. And so these receptors are too primitive, they're too basic to understand where a certain smell or a certain chemical is coming from. All the E. coli can do is just swim, wiggle, wiggle, wiggle until it comes across that smell, or until that smell gets stronger or weaker. And so they kind of use time to solve the problem of locating these smells, as opposed to how we locate smells by like angling our heads and like moving towards it very like intentfully. And so what happens, with these types of organisms that respond to their environments, they keep swimming straight as long as things seem better now than they did a moment ago. And this requires something incredibly, I think, like complex and super freaking cool to me. It's that even E. coli need to have some sort of concept of before and after. They need to be kind of like keeping track of whether or not this chemical smell is getting stronger or weaker in the direction they're swimming, to either tumble away or keep swimming. And so it's a type of like proto-perception. It's like a really, really simple form of memory. And this type of action, it's older than any type of nervous system that biologists can put their fingers on. And you'll see like it starts to matter a lot later when we talk about special experiences, things like subjective experience and consciousness, things that aren't simply sensing and reacting. And so the discussion then, I think in like chapter 2 or chapter 3, it's still early on in the book, it's how these signalings between the outside world and the internal world, how those signals looped in on themselves again. So they're speculating here, or Peter Godfrey's kind of speculating a little bit here, but he said that animals probably began not with lone cells drifting together, but as these types of cells that divided, and for one reason or other, they failed to completely divide, so they were kind of like stuck together. And once these cells, they live as parts of a body, the equipment that they used to sense the outside world and understand the outside world and then kind of have an internal response, that system, it repurposed itself a little bit. So now all of a sudden, imagine you have like two cells that are stuck together for some reason. Each of them independently have an ability to perceive the outside world and some sort of connector arc that relays that information to the internal world. But now that internal world is the other cell as well, since they're stuck together. So now all of a sudden you have a signaling system that's turning in on itself. And this internal system, this internal signaling, is really, really expensive. It takes up a lot of energy. That's essentially what neurons are. They're systems that are running within our larger system. And so a question is like, how worth it is this for an animal, evolutionarily speaking, to develop these capacities, to develop these inward kind of like loopings. And so then I guess the discussion kind of moves a little bit towards finding when this first occurred, or when kind of like complex life that's able to like loop back in on itself first emerged. And it's a funny like anecdote, which I think is like pretty telling of like most science or like most findings nowadays. But there was a guy, Reg Sprigg, who was a geologist, and he ended up kind of like flipping a rock over while he was eating lunch one day, and he found this like this fossil here. And for him, that was like, oh my goodness, this is huge news. I need to report this. I think we just found something that's older than anything that was found in the Cambrian explosion. The Ediacaran kind of like epoch or era came before that, and then he noticed that, I guess, like the place he was around, the fossils that were nearby, they were all simples, and he found this one which looks like a type of complex and moving animal. So he reports that journal entry, or he makes a paper, reports it to Nature, the biggest journal in science, and then he gets rejected. And so he submits it to like the second highest one, and he gets rejected. And then like all the third and like the higher tier journals, and they're all rejecting him until it makes its way onto like a really, let's say like a low tier journal. And so these findings, they were just like lost for a long time, because no one reads the bottom journals, thinking that they're just like of lower quality. And it took around 10 years before people to notice that, wow, the first fossil record here was found of animals living before the Cambrian. And so the Cambrian, it was characterized by animals that were very soft-bodied. There wasn't really too much shell stuff left, or shell stuff hadn't like really developed at that point. They were short on teeth. They had no teeth, no claws, no eyes, nothing hard. Everything was almost like very like spongy and soft. Think of like a jellyfish-like almost. And so in the Ediacaran, that's when it's believed that these this ability to perceive the outside world and then relay that information and kind of loop it around within yourself, that's when it started off. The Cambrian is the famous Cambrian explosion, when there's a huge kind of like change and development in biodiversity or whatever. And we start to see a lot of these type of crustaceans and types of like complex creatures. And what arrives with them is what all of the Ediacaran animals lacked. These things have eyes and antenna and claws. And so now all of a sudden these animals are able to like orient and direct their attention and direct their movements. And so his explanation for why this developed during the Cambrian explosion was because of a type of feedback loop. So animals kind of became part of each other's lives through predation. Prey had to hide from predators, and predators had to get better at tracking prey, and then prey had to defend harder, just like this evolutionary arms race. And so now each side, or each animal, I guess, was a part of the other animal's environment. And the environment was evolving in response to yourself. And so, for the first time ever in the history of life, not paying attention or not directing behavior in a certain way would lead you to being eaten, as opposed to E. coli, where there's no real consequence if you kind of like drift too far away from the chemicals. You just keep swimming, and then eventually you'll hit it again. And so a passage I took here, like close to the third chapter now, says that on both sides, passing from the Ediacaran into the Cambrian and beyond, lives became entangled and senses began to open up. Nervous systems had to expand and get more complicated, until, in one tiny example of this sensory and behavioral entangling, a rubber-encased mammal and a color-changing cephalopod find themselves staring at each other in the Pacific Ocean. And that's this fork in the road where humans and cephalopods diverge. That's the last time that our DNA was in front of each other. And so in this book, is pretty funny. They characterize octopi as very like mischievous and like not like almost like naughty animals. And funny enough, Claudius Aelianus, like a historian from the 3rd century, he also characterized them in this way. And yeah, it's like they're. Well, I guess we'll guess. I want to talk about like some of the anecdotes, but one of the anecdotes that Peter Godfrey reports of having is that he was just like trying to like say hi to a little octopus, and instead of doing what a normal animal does, just like look at you, it wraps his tentacles around you and then kind of tastes you and suckles on you and stuff like that. And it's his way of, or their way of, seeing you. And so that was like, he's like, wow, like what crafty and nifty little creatures that are acknowledging my existence. And so I guess then we look a little bit about like the history of, so from that split off between proto arthropods and proto mammals, there was these mollusks. They were the ones that octopi and other cephalopods are thought to like come from originally. And so we started off as these like little mollusks they started off with these little mollusks that could like, maybe they had this like muscle underneath them, and they could use that muscle, which was a mouth essentially, to eat things on the seabed. And then what happened is that they kind of developed into this type of maybe like limpet-like muscle, where the mouth became a little bit more dexterous, and the cone kind of like, or the shell kind of like, I guess like raised itself a little bit. And this came with like two different purposes. Having a cone-shaped shell allows you, or grants you, this ability to kind of be a little bit more buoyant. So you can fill it up with gas, or fill it up with different like liquids, and all of a sudden you become a little bit more buoyant. So no longer are you stuck flat on the seabed. You can kind of like move up a little bit and like kind of wiggle up and down. And so this seemed to be like advantageous for them. It allows them to kind of get more food and so on and so on. So that progression continued until finally they no longer even want to be on the seabed. They had complete liftoff. And that's when that's where you see this type of like nautilus type of creature. And these prehistoric nautili that were like 20 feet long or whatever, that don't exist anymore. But this is the closest type of thing that still exists to this day. And so from these guys came the cuttlefish and the octopus. And so the evolution of cephalopods essentially yielded at this point. And the octopus was a body of pure possibility. It was no longer constrained and kind of like limited in a way by this cone-shaped head. It's like really weird. It's a weird like evolutionary mystery why exactly this shell was discarded. There's like different theories and like ideas, but it still is like by and large a mystery why this was kind of like dropped off, because it seems so counterintuitive for an animal to let go of its one trait that's been keeping it alive for the longest time, to let go of the shell that's allowed it to kind of like reproduce and continue on, and be just like these really squishy and fragile type of creatures like the cuttlefish and the octopus. And so then there's like, I guess there's a discussion about like the actual intelligence of these octopi, and they start to talk about these octopi just as though they're any other type of animal. When you run them through like experiments in the lab, they don't do a lot better than rats will do. Or a lot better than other types of animals like birds or dogs will do. The most interesting thing about the octopus is all of the anecdotal stuff that they exhibit. So in a series of experiments in Otago, or in Germany essentially, they found out that, or they didn't find out, but they saw that the octopi figured out how to turn the lights off by squirting water and like squirting little jets at the water bulbs when no one was watching. And this problem got so expensive, they kept like destroying the lights and kind of like messing with the electricity, that they had to release all the octopi. So a win for the octopi there. In New Zealand, something similar kind of happened, where not something similar, but one octopus really didn't like one of the staff members or one of the researchers. And so every time the researcher would pass by, she would get like shot at with a jet of water. And then they've continued to do research on these octopi, and they've figured out that they can easily tell people apart. which is why that one researcher was the one being targeted consistently and no one else. Who knows why? Another, I guess, anecdote was Dr. Boyle, and she was feeding thawed squid down a long row of tanks. And then on the way back, the first octopus was holding its squid conspicuously. And it crossed the tank slowly, watching her the whole way, and then dropped the squid down the drain. So not only was it like demonstrating that it didn't like the squid, it was demonstrating that it knew when the researcher was paying attention to them so that they could see that they disliked the squid. So they have theory of mind. Not only can they perceive and sense and remember and do all these cool things, but they have this ability to understand that you are an agent, and that you can only see when your eyes are kind of looking towards you. And they made sure to like show their what's the word, like disgust of the squid only when the researcher was watching them with their eyes. And so I guess like moving on to their biology a little bit, to the evolution of their nervous system. They have as many neurons as a cat or as a dog, basically. However, 2/3 of them are outside of their body, outside of their brain. 2/3 are in their arms or in their tentacles, and they have 3 hearts. So they're as far from normal type of like mammal biology as you can get. Early work ended up finding out that the arms, when they were severed from the body, they could still perform certain tasks. They could still grasp things and sense things and have like these chemical responses to certain things out in the environment. And it got even more complicated when some later work in Hockner's lab, I think he was also in Germany, where they learned to steer a single arm through a transparent maze without using their arms. So the arm was able to like navigate through a maze without the person being able to see, without the octopus being able to see the maze itself. So it shows like 2 different types of control that's happening. One on the tentacle level and then one on the cerebral level. So it's almost like they have like 8 minds. One mind in each of their, like, they can all act independently in a way. And the way that Godfrey kind of talks about it is that the octopus is suffused with nervousness. The octopus lives outside the usual brain-body divide. They're so different than us because we think about the brain and body as having this type of divide. You can close your eyes and think of stuff, but try and think about thinking with your senses, thinking with your arms. And so I guess this is another issue for evolution to explain. It's why build a mind this expensive for an animal or for a creature that's completely asocial, who lives a life in isolation. And so there's 2 other pressures that you can kind of like, or 2 other things you can say about this. Well, first they look at primatologists, and one possible answer, I guess, is in saying, well, there's a difference in foragers. Some foragers are specialists. So think about a frog trying to catch like a fly. It does the same task every single time. And then think of other types of foragers where they need to like adapt their approach to every single case. So think about, I don't know, apes, depending on what food that they're trying to get at, they're going to attack it in a different way, use different tools. And so octopuses, they're presented with that challenge in their environment. Each meal is completely different. And so maybe that was one reason for them being forced to develop this really like complicated mind. The second is of coordination. Well, it's so expensive to have a body with no joints and no fixed shape, because it's so difficult to govern it. Like, for it to act in synchronicity is very expensive. And many of those neurons that exist to make animals controllable, octopi would probably need even more. And so this is kind of like where they diverge from us, but at the same time, they're converging with us. Even though they split off from humans so long ago, before either of us had eyeballs, before either of us had long-term memory, before either of us engaged in play, they still end up kind of making their way to those things. They're still able to have a theory of mind, to dream in some sense, to have long-term memory, to engage in play, even though we came from completely different lineages. And so it's really odd that they were kind of like endowed with this complexity, given all of it. Just doesn't make sense from an evolutionary standpoint for them to have this much neuronal oomph, especially for how asocial they are, for how short their lives are, and so on. And so they're just a big mystery. And the biggest question, or once the book turns into like philosophy, I guess, because all of that was like descriptive stuff, just learning about how like this the history of the octopi. Then it turns a little bit to philosophy, and I'm sure if any of you guys have like taken an undergrad course in philosophy or something, you come across Thomas Nagel's paper, What It's Like to Be a Bat. And it's not that like, is a bat similar to us? The point is that what must it feel like to be a bat? Is there any feeling to it at all? Or do they just not feel anything? And they're just like these automatic little creatures. And I guess he moves the question to, well, what must it be like to be an octopus? Do they have awareness? Do they have consciousness? And what Peter Godfrey thinks is that consciousness is something that happens later down the line. If we want to answer this question of what it must be like to be an octopus, we need to look at things that came before consciousness. And so one form of subjective experience is consciousness. So subjective experience, from my point of view to the external world, one of those modes, one of those ways of experiencing is conscious experience. But that's not the only way to experience the world. He says that like a squid may very well feel pain without being conscious of that pain in any like rich sense, maybe in more reactive or perceptive way. And he thinks that the first place to look at is sentience. And it's not some sort of like substance that we should add to matter, nor is it a type of property of everything, like the panpsychist might think. It comes out of the evolution of sensing and acting, of being a living system with a point of view. All sentience is an ability to feel. That's it. It's not ability to perceive or to kind of like ruminate on things or to be aware. It's just an ability to feel. And so the question then is, well, where did sentience come from? Since sentience must come before consciousness, since the simpler form of subjective experience. And so I guess there's two kind of views now that we have to contrast. There's the latecomer view and a transformative view. And so if you guys have studied any psychology, you might be familiar with patient DF. This patient had a type of like carbon monoxide poisoning, and then they suffered cognitive deficits. And they were asked to perform certain tasks. One of those tasks was sliding a card into like a slot that was angled at different, where like the slot was angled in different ways. And so this individual, they were able to accomplish the task of putting the card in the slot, but they never reported seeing it. They had no ability to say like, oh, I'm seeing this, like this is occurring, like I'm aware of this. And so on this type of reading or understanding, on this latecomer view, experience requires late machinery. So experiencing something comes after our ability to mechanically do that thing, after integrating these senses into an inner model of the world. And so feeling is recent and rare. And then on the transformative view is a more simple form of subjective experience. It's saying that subjective experience, this like first-person awareness, first-person sentience, that came first, and then machinery reshaped it or adapted to it. And so it's like this fight between whether or not it was awareness that came first or machinery that came first. And I guess there's a debate ongoing there. But he proposes maybe it's something like a little bit of both. Maybe they both kind of like evolved hand in hand, one feeding into the other. He suggests that the reason octopi might be conscious is by thinking about what an octopus is like. So they're very, very curious creatures, and they're very, very novelty seeking. And not all creatures possess that trait. As you may or may not know, like certain dogs, depending on their personality, hate new things and are afraid of everything that's new. I had a dog that was like that. Anything that they didn't see before when they were young, they didn't want to deal with it, afraid, would bark at it, and so on. Octopi, they go completely the other way. When they see something they don't understand or know, they seek it. They're very, very curious in that way. But this situation, the reason that they're curious has no human analog. They're not curious for the same reasons we might be curious, or dogs might be curious, or other mammals might be curious. Because if their bodies and minds are sharing the control of the organism, then their curiosity is partly directed and partly not directed, or at least partly directed by arms and partly not directed by brain, or something like that. The nearest comparisons that I guess Godfrey-Smith tries to give us is think about blinking or breathing. There's these things that automatically happen, but if we focus our attention onto them, then we can control them as well. And maybe the octopus arm is kind of like blinking and breathing. They can do their own thing, but they can also be guided by the central organism, or the central guidance system. Or in other words, periphery, their peripheral nervous systems always have a type of say. And so then I guess the discussion kind of moves a little bit to other cephalopods, or cuttlefish. So cephalopods, both, I think it's just cuttlefish. I might be wrong here. I don't know, but cuttlefish, they're pretty similar to octopi, but they're a bit different in that they're more of like a hovercraft, and they have 10 arms instead of 8. And they're very, very bright as well. They shine all these type of cool LED looking stripes and colors and all that type of stuff. And it's really peculiar because when scientists have tried to test whether or not these cephalopods can see in color, they found that basically no. Behavioral tests, they're all in consensus more or less that they cannot tell stimuli apart just based off of colored. And so these creatures end up producing something that they can't see. They'll match the backgrounds that they can't see. And they'll even change colors when something's behind their own back that they're not paying attention to. And so there's 2 candidate answers that emerge to explain why this is the case from an evolutionary standpoint. The chromatophores, which sit above their light-sensitive cells, they could possibly just act as color filters, letting one receptor behave like several of those receptors, a type of trick that butterflies will sometimes use. And what they found was that a certain type of photoreceptor genes active in the skin of octopi and certain cephalopods, they kind of they act like detached skin senses. So they're able to sense light in a way that's detached from the rest of the organism and act independently. So now all of a sudden, octopi, not only is their mind diffuse around their body, can their tentacles operate kind of on their own and independently, and they also have this layer of skin on them that acts independently to all those other systems. So it would be like asking you, what does it feel like to see with your skin? And so then I guess we get into, what it means to be anything, what it means to have a self. Hume tried to answer that, and what he ended up saying is, what it means to exist, or to perceive, or to have any type of experience and awareness. He closed his eyes and he says, okay, all I have are bundles of passing perceptions, things like heat, cold, light, shade, love, hatred. Godfrey doesn't completely agree with him. He thinks that he missed a couple things. Human experience is like an integrated scene. It's not a list of things. The way Hume talked about it was first I'm feeling this, then I feel that, then I feel this, then I feel that, and they had the type of sequence. Peter Godfrey thinks, no, it's like a painting. It's not like the red and red comes before the blue. They happen at the same time. And what's also important is that we have narratives and internal monologue that run. alongside these paintings and these integrated scenes. So Dewey's line on Hume was essentially that one that I like the way he frames it a little bit. He thinks that the ideas that Hume found, were in constant flux. And really what he was saying was just a succession of silently uttered words. Vygotsky, the psychologist, he argued that children have this type of ability to engage in like internalized speaking before they're even able to speak normally. And that inner voice is really an outer one that's just flipped on itself and turned into a tool for organizing our thought. And that's all it is. And the mechanisms he offers is of efference copying, which I don't think we need to get too into because I think it's like too tangential to this whole octopi debate or minds debate. But I guess different people in history have thought about what it means to be a self or what it means to have self to be different things. Some people see it as a sequence of things, as a chain. Some people see it as an integrative scene. Some people see it as the ability to narrate or to explain and organize things. And cephalopods, on the other hand, they're on a completely different road and in a completely different world to us. Godfrey looks at the human mind, or his picture of the human mind is just a mind of loops. Some run outside our skin. Some, like for example, you can talk to yourself out loud. You can write a note to yourself in the future. And these things can come back to you. It's almost like we engage with the environment engages back with us. Type of like embodied cognition or grounded cognition, if you want to call it that. Cephalopods, their display, like their ability to change color and all that type of stuff, doesn't have those loops built into them. It's just a one-way street. Everything that we perceive, or all the information that we receive, it kind of goes up to our brain, and then we sort it out, and then we act. And it's really weird then to see that cephalopods, they don't act in that way. Like their bodies, their systems just aren't organized in that way. They don't have the same loops that we have. And it's one of the limits, I guess, that cephalopods face when we're comparing them to us. And so another big mystery that is mostly unresolved, but I guess there's a couple hypotheses he talks about, and this is, I think, the last thing I'll really talk about, is that these incredibly complex creatures only live about 1 to 2 years. Some octopi have been found to live up to 4. The ones that live really deep down, like at low, just really, really far down, they can live up to 4. And it seems really odd that they're so complicated, and they seem so, he describes them as worldly, like so wise, when they're all just so young. They're so rich in experience. Their lives, like, you can't even imagine how rich their experience is just because of their embodied cognition. But their lives are so compressed. If you take the other mollusks that exist, that were descendants of them, or that were the predecessors of these octopi and these cephalopods, they're able to live up to like 20 to 30 years. Some can even live a lot longer. Nautili can live quite long as well. So why is it the case that these octopi only live 1 to 2 years? And so there's some, I guess, like hypotheses or ideas. And I guess it's a really like evolutionary way of looking at it. Death by accident is no puzzle. So getting eaten up by another animal, that makes complete sense. Or from some sort of injury, that makes sense. But dying from old age, it still is a bit of a mystery in biology. We're not like automobiles. Organisms aren't like these parts that you need to replace every 5 years, or they just kind of like wear down. We're constantly regenerating. And so the big question then for biology is, well, why can't we just like regenerate indefinitely? And one biologist's answer is that it all comes down to the mutations that are naturally selected for us. And so selection barely sees a mutation that only acts late. Imagine I have a kid and he has some sort of mutation, but that mutation only shows itself late in life. According to if he lives long enough to bang it out and have more kids, then it doesn't matter too much if the mutation is going to kind of like cause him trouble later in life. Almost nobody ends up surviving that long in nature to suffer these mutations. And so the idea is that these harmful and late-acting mutations, they must then accumulate. And they must have accumulated greatly in octopi. Williams added the trade-off, essentially, that sometimes mutations have a bonus and a negative. Imagine, for example, if I said, like, okay, you're going to have a mutation that will make you, I don't know, a lot more fast, but it'll also make you more prone to heart disease. And sometimes those trade-offs are worth doing for nature. Especially if you won't be alive long enough to pay the bill or to have to suffer the consequences. So we'll take the mutations that benefit us in the short term. They're going to hurt us, even if they're going to hurt us in the long term. And so that's probably what happened with the cephalopods since they lost this shell and they became hunted. They were like easy prey, essentially. And so it's very unlikely that they were going to make it multiple seasons. And so it made sense for them to gear all of their energy, to spend all of their energy on having as rich of a perceptual experience and having as complicated like cognitive machinery if you're only going to be alive for 1 year, 2 years, and if it ends up helping you to procreate. There's exceptions to this, however, which are really, they kind of like throw a wrench in this like idea. They ended up filming this one type of octopi, a deep sea octopi, who ended up brooding, or like octopi, what they do is they blow fresh water onto their eggs to oxygenate them, so they get enough oxygen, obviously. And so what they found was that they were filming this deep sea octopi, and he did this brooding action for around 4 years in cold water. So already living 4 times longer is crazy, and then on top of that, brooding for 4 times longer is crazy. So it suggests almost like it's not their biology that's stopping them from existing or for living for a long time. It might be something else. And I guess it doesn't give us good answers to these anecdotes or to these issues. It just gives us, it's like he's like gets like, I think, poetic at this part. And he says the cuttlefish's death, he ended up observing like the death of a certain cuttlefish. And it was this transition from swimming deep in her quiet world through a slow spiraling ascent, drifting onto the noisy nature of ours. It's like they live like such rich, quick, and perceptually dense lives, and then they just turn into ghosts and disappear so quickly. There's the decaying of cephalopods is incredibly fast. Within a span of like a week, they'll start to lose their tentacles and then turn white. And so it just seems so almost like sad and like poetic and like dramatic for them to die in such a violent way. And the book, I guess, like loops back to Octopus, which was this like community of octopi that they found off the coast of Australia / New Zealand. And they tried to explain, well, how did it come to be the case that dozens of octopi were living together in this type of like little community, constantly high-fiving each other, if they're known to be these creatures that are very solitary and just don't like the company of others? And they said, well, maybe it was because one day a shiny metal object fell onto the bed of that seafloor. One octopus was like, hey, this is a good place to eat. So he brought his shells from foraging, ate them there. Those shells, at the same time, they offer like housing or protection. So other octopi found those shells and were like, hey, you know what? This is not a bad spot. There's some like stuff to protect myself with. And they would keep bringing their food back. And like it built into like this little community where there was like a lot of shells all over the place, and they were able to protect themselves with these shells. And the trade-off, I guess, was good enough for surviving and living with these other octopi. But given that they live such short lives and they've never been found to do this, it's also like a bit of a mystery. It's funny, like, listening to these different philosophers explain what they're seeing in the water because of just how alien octopi are. Obviously, Godfrey-Smith, when he saw them interacting, he's like, oh, they're all boxing and like fighting each other. And then Lindquist read it as like, oh, they're all just like a high-fiving each other or registering like who is who. And I guess they continued to do a little bit of research and they learned a few more things. They learned that they were able to some extent, predict what an octopus was feeling by their color. So that they found that the darkness of the skin was a good predictor for whether or not an octopus would advance or stand its ground. And then when it was more paler gray and blotchy, then it was more likely to kind of like back down. But again, each octopus was different in how they acted and the colors that they showed. So it was hard to kind of draw any definitive answers. And yeah, I guess this slide was just the one talking about how that little octopus civilization came to be. And I guess I want to leave with even another mystery or confusing, let's say, paradox with this issue of like consciousness and these creatures. In 1972, the picture was that cephalopods burst into existence around 170 million years ago, inviting this idea that, oh, maybe they were this one-off accident. Humans had it, and then maybe it just happened one-off again. However, there was new evidence that suggested that the split between cuttlefish and octopus was also really far back. Here, if you can see it, so imagine this is like life, complicated life, multicellular organisms, organisms that can direct kind of like behavior and attention. And then this is the split between us and octopi, or mammals and these cephalopods. These are some arthropods. And then you get to octopi. And not only did this branched out one time, but it branched out 2 times. And so it makes it likely that large complicated nervous systems evolved at least twice within cephalopods, once in cuttlefish and squid, once in octopi, by around 100 million years. And there's even newer evidence that supports this. The octopus genome around 10 years ago, as they kind of like decoded it, and they found certain molecules that were very separate in the 2 lineages, and they were able to kind of trace them back that way. And so now we have 3 types of creatures: humans, or mammals, humans, octopi, and cuttlefish, which all have capacities of episodic like memory, perceptual engagements with perceptual like responses to the environment, and they engage in play, they have curiosity, they can recognize people, they have theory of mind. And so they're this type of like independent experiment, Godfrey says, in the evolution of minds. And then the last bit of the book, I guess I should stop talking, I've been talking for a long time, was that, we need to be really happy that we have water, because without water, it wouldn't have been possible. And to also, well, what did I say here? Everything happened in water. Is that, yeah, maybe the answers we're looking for aren't just, they don't have one good answer. There's really complex phenomenon that just doesn't have one good answer. And it's just like a collection of lots of different things. And so answering why they have this really rich perceptual life, answering why they have episodic like memory, answering why they live such short lives, why they got rid of their shells, why they die so quickly, answering all of these questions, maybe there's just not one good answer. Like, he's been trying to find this whole book. Maybe it's a lot of different small causes and a lot of different things. In the same way, like the honeybee colony collapses are just because of one thing. It's like lots of different things. Maybe this is the type of explanation we need to point at when figuring out why octopi ended up being the way they are, or why cuttlefish ended up being the way they are. And what's more is that we need to be careful if the oceans don't end up dying for a collection of lots of reasons that might not be obvious right now, but will lead to their demise. In the same way a honeybee colony can just like collapse all of a sudden once it reaches a certain stress threshold. The same thing could happen with the oceans, acidification, all this other type of stuff. And so he kind of like leaves the book with a little thank you to the ocean, saying that when you dive into the sea, you're diving into the origin of all of us and into the origin of mind. Nice. I'm done for talking. I'm gonna drink some water. What are your guys' thoughts on all of these neat creatures, if any? Have we anthropomorphized them too much? Have we poorly answered things? Is it fair to say that they're like aliens? I mean, I guess like one thing that all of this made me kind of think of was this mind-body divide. So obviously in philosophy of mind, or just in philosophy in general, this trying to understand what is a mind, or what separates a mind from a body. It's relatively distinct and clear-cut with people. It's clear because you can be in a sensory deprivation tank and still have a sense of self. But I think that this sense of self, or this conscious awareness, as you may, it might be something that's a little bit more something that, like, in terms of degrees, how William James was suggesting it to be. That a mind doesn't just spontaneously emerge, nor is it as categorically distinct as we like to think it to be in humans. It's not like a plant doesn't have a mind, we have a mind. It's just like it's a gradient. And the octopus is a really nice example on the other spectrum of it, of how diffuse a mind can be in a body. For us, 80 billion neurons up in here, and then a few more neurons, down our nervous system. But for octopi, it's completely diffused. So sense of self must be way more, I don't know. I think it's cool to try and think about what their experience must be like. That's all I had, I guess. If any of you guys have thoughts that you'd like to share, I would love to hear someone else's voice instead of my own. Um, but I think this book solidified the octopus as like one of my top favorite animals. That's for sure. You like the cuttlefish? They look even like more crazy. They look even more crazy than octopi, I think. They're like a hovercraft.
100%. So that would mean that rise to the surface.
Yeah. Yes, they're crazy. But the fact that they're also so separate from octopi on like the evolutionary time scale is so confusing to me. Like it's almost like a pattern now that mind evolves. If it was like a one-off, it's like, oh, just octopi have these really cool capacities that humans have. And they're really distant from us. Cool, it might be like a one-off, but now that there's three, it's like shit, that's a pattern now. Maybe mine just develops.
When you're great and greatlier is may say it's much more of a clear picture. And then so wait, so just really quickly, what was the sort of evolutionary difference between cuttlefish and octopus? And like, do you think in your perspective that they have like this sort of, they place differently on the gradient of having a mind and like how complicated their mind is?
Like, yeah. No, I think they're both like maybe equally as complicated. They're obviously it's very different, so it's like it's hard to compare a human to an octopus in the same way it's hard to compare cuttlefish to an octopus, but they share obviously a lot more similarities between each other than we do. But they are like they were what 100 million years apart, which is big enough it's safe enough to say that like the only other connection at that point is the mollusk. And so like it's kind of I think it's like a fair thing to say that like a mollusk doesn't have a mind. It can like interact with its environment kind of, but not to the extent as like a cuttlefish. And if that was the fork, but their common ancestor was the mollusk, it's like holy crap, they completely developed minds. Um yeah,
It's amazing.
makes a great appetizer. Yeah, so if I can eat octopus or octopi after all this. But yeah. I never liked octopi or octopus. Like I tried it, I'm pretty sure I tried it a couple times. I never I don't know. I guess seafood in general.
Well, they're amazing, man. Try some takoyaki balls.
Yeah. Takoyaki bowls?
Takoyaki?
Takoyaki.
I think, but yeah, no, like actually the bar. Yeah, with like a bunch of kupile. But it's a shame because they're so conscious and I have so much more guilt eating.
The craziest thing for me with these guys, or one of the crazy things for me, is just how short their lives are and how much they learn in that time frame. Like all of them learn so many things and like relationships and theory of mind and all that type of stuff in the span of a year, and then they die. It seems it's so sad. It's like
It really is. I feel like there's some sort of correlation in, oh, maybe not insects, but probably in animals. Again, and this is just like crackpot theory, that the more complicated an organism is, the shorter its lifespan. Like humans have like engineered our lifespans to be double what it originally was.
yeah.
But with octopuses and cuttlefish, they're so complicated and their lifespans are so short. Mollusks, their lifespans are so long, so less complicated in like my unknowledgeable understanding. But like maybe it just lends to this idea that like, octopi are far more complicated than we even think, because in order to keep something running that complicated, you can only do it for a short amount of time. But yeah, you can only do it for a year. You can only do it for 6 months, basically. And then it's just sort of like, well,
What was the point of all that effort? Like, but then it's also weird that they it's almost like at the same time, octopi, they almost choose when they die. So they mate once in their life usually. And so what they do is like they'll eat a lot of food just like a bear, like when it's getting ready to hibernate. So it has a lot of energy. And then it'll have all the eggs and then oxygenate the eggs until it dies. It's almost like a voluntary like choice. And it makes sure that like until its last breath, it's just giving oxygen to the eggs instead of kind of like letting them be, going out to eat and then coming back, and then maybe they're alive, maybe they're not, but just like complete sacrifice each time. And you can, and given the anecdote with the Pacific ocean deep octopus, whatever, and that it could live for 4 years doing that, it's like, damn, maybe octopi could really like extend their lifespans if they just behaved in a different way.
But they just like work hard.
Yeah,
Like,
they just like they don't want to live anymore. Maybe.
Hmm?
It's like I feel like that. I mean, that also happens with like some people or some animals. It's like you can, to some extent, you choose when you die. Like if you're real, like when you're really sick and old, like you can keep on eating really healthy and getting sleep and like doing all the things that are going to extend your life like more and more and more. See ya. But at some point you just choose. It's like, no, I'm just gonna stop eating. I'm just gonna go to bed and then my body will shut down. And that's what these octopi seem to be doing every single time.
Maybe there are. I mean, I caught that the idea that like, maybe there are stressors placed on octopus that we're not yet aware of. Oh, don't they wear their emotions and their being on their skin? So it's easier to understand what an octopus is going through emotionally, or what a cuttlefish is going through emotionally than, let's say, something that doesn't change it, the color of its skin, something like a fish. And so it's really just love. If you are, to put it as a really bad example, if you're yellow for a lot of your life, if you're happy, cuttlefish, why, or octopus, why are you choosing to give up in the end? But yeah, no, I think another thing is, yeah, we really do just choose. Hey, I'm going to direct my life in such a way where I'm going to die. I mean, some people choose, I'm going to direct my life in such a way where I'm going to die. I'm going to do it in such a way where I'm going to die. 100. I think for octopuses, it's a bit different. Octopuses don't really choose to sleep late at night or choose to smoke cigarettes. But it's just really strange. I'm not entirely sure why they choose to roll over after they're like this sort of, they, have their eggs, they achieve their purpose, and then they're like, well, no, I don't have this requirement of existing. Maybe they do have a mind, so they can contextualize this emotion of, or this thought, this feeling of, wow, I did what I need to do. And I guess the question is can that come in the form of a thought?
Mm-hmm.
And that brooding octopus, right? For 4 years, like that, the guy didn't think, but the octopus didn't think, I did what I needed to do. It could have thought, I am still doing what I need to do.
Mm-hmm. Do you think octopi have thoughts? I think they have thoughts. They must.
That's amazing. I think from the evidence that this book has, I think octopus have like very simple thoughts or thoughts.
And like what about the anecdotes with in like the lab settings when like when the researcher was feeding the squid to every single octopi like down the row, and then the one at the very front, it like held onto it, like showed it up like this, waited for the person to come back to in front of like their cage and look at them and then throw it out at them. Like that seems like a really complicated thought. Like it's not even just like expressing like your discomfort or disgust. It's expressing it's hoping that someone else sees your discomfort and distress.
Yeah, exactly. It like that is, I don't know, like 5 standard deviations beyond what a dog could do, in my opinion. Or maybe not like a dog. Maybe there's like a turtle.
Yeah.
But like that's crazy. It's just crazy. I really do think that they can rationalize their existence. Especially if the way that they die is the way that we think that they die. From the bounty of it. And then that, if you can rationalize your existence, you could probably rationalize some other stuff. You know? Like, hey, this researcher is going to come back and throw squid. I'm going to start a little bit of it. And like, that's just amazing.
Yeah. Okay, well I gotta go now, but it was fun.
Weird.
The little chat. Hope to see you guys next week. I'll pick another book and or do something else. Yeah, nice for you guys to show up.
It's very nice. Yep. All right. Keep going, Chris. We love you.